Chapter 3, Intruders. Back in the Kingdom of Galark, in the city of Amand, the night after Rio had defeated the Minotaurs and saved the day, the cafeteria on the first floor of the Rika Guild in that Rio was staying at was also open to the general public as a luxury high-end restaurant. Rio was enjoying dinner with Celia and Asia in a private room. Directly opposite to the door of the private room they were using was an open window. It allowed them to look over the spacious back courtyard as they enjoyed the finest food and liquor, and on days with good weather, the terrace was open for seating, too. Having such a wide garden at the back of an inn is wonderful. It's been well maintained. Celia gazed at the garden in an uplifted mood as she waited for the next dish to be carried out. It's an inn. Would be perfect if it had a bathtub deep enough to submerge in, Asia uttered simply. That's dreaming a little too high, there. Baths like the one in the stone house aren't common in the straw region. Isn't it enough that there's a bathroom in each room? Celia asked with a wry smile. There were bathrooms in the rooms allocated to Rio's party, too, with a shallow bathtub that allowed for washing up, but they didn't compare to the bath installed in the stone house. However, bathrooms were already more than enough by straw region standards. The two of you are completely accustomed to deeper bathtubs, I see, Rio said with a smile. Yup, I like taking baths. Makes me sleepy. Asia nodded, speaking softly. This girl really falls asleep, you know? I was so surprised when I got in after her, Celia said tiredly. The warmth is comfortable. Geez, Asia's blunt remark made Celia puff up her cheeks slightly. Ahaha, Rio laughed with amusement. From appearances alone, Asia looked more mature than Celia did, but at times like this it was hard to tell who was older. Thus, their conversation continued until a waiter knocked on the door to the room and carried in the newest dishes. Thank you for waiting. Would you like to select your next drink too? The employee asked, noticing that there was little alcohol remaining in the decanter. Let's see. Cecilia, would you like to choose the next one? I'm not too familiar with the different makers, Rio said. Having been raised as a noble, Celia should have been more familiar with brands and makers than Rio. I'm not very knowledgeable myself, Celia said as she looked at the menu. Then how about this house wine, in the same decanter as this, please? The wine on the front sign of the store seemed to have attracted her attention, as she pointed it out for their order. Understood. The store attendant responded respectfully, leaving without a sound. Where was the wine made? Rio asked. Here in Duke Krisha's territory. It's a product made in the vineyards of the Rika Guild. Since it's a locally made item and all, how about we just sit back and enjoy ourselves? Celia said, giggling happily. Yes, I think that's a good choice. Rio nodded with a faint smile. He normally couldn't help himself from drinking the alcohol made by the spirit folk, but having a straw-made drink for once sounded good. All the more so during a time like this when they were living an irregular, luxurious lifestyle. The new dishes are also delicious. Asia maneuvered her knife and fork elegantly to pick at the newly served dishes while smacking her lips. A gentle mood had settled in the peaceful and refined private room. It sounds kind of noisy out there, Rio said with a glance at the door. Shouting could be heard down the corridor. It seemed as though someone was arguing. Since the restaurant was so quiet, the slightly raised voices could be heard quite well. Is it a fight? Celia murmured worriedly. As more time passed, the arguing party seemed to be drawing closer to their room. Then, right on the other side of the door, the aggravated voice of a young man could be heard. I'm telling you, I insist on using the private room I had last time. If it's money, I can pay 3 times the usual rate. This isn't a matter of money. The room is currently in use by other customers. We will not ask them to leave. A man who was most likely an employee of the inn objected firmly. Judging by the situation, Rio took a guess at what was happening and spoke rather tiredly. It sounds like this room may be in demand. What should we do? Celia asked, looking at Rio. Let's wait a little longer and see what happens. They could be trying to use a different room, so it would be a little silly to purposely step outside if we were wrong. Rio's words were simple as he gave a gentle smile. We're visiting as very important guests. The upper class of this city will hear of this, a different male voice to the aggravated man said, speaking carefully. His voice also sounded rather young, his tone overbearing. In reality, by dangling their influence, it was clear they were making a threat. Perhaps they were used to things like this. If you're referring to Lady Liselot, then please, feel free to appeal to her directly. We are simply following our instructions. The inn's employee did not back down. What a stubborn fool. Enough, it's no use speaking with you. You'd better watch your back later, the second male said as a final warning. As you wish, the employee replied bluntly. The aggravated man must have run out of patience, as he spoke up in irritation. That's enough, Stuart. We'll settle this with the other customers ourselves. You may not, the employee protested, but the angry man's voice rose loudly. Move it. You're in the way. Yes, sir. You cannot do this. The employee yelled. Perhaps he had been pushed out of the way. The quarrel was occurring right outside the room Rio and the others were in. It was almost certain that their room was the one in question. I'll deal with this. The two of you should ignore them. Rio sighed with annoyance from the bottom of his heart as he addressed Celia and Asia. Immediately after that, the door to their room flew open without even a knock. Stuart Huguenot was Duke Huguenot's eldest son. With his father the most prominent great lord in the kingdom, he was the prodigal son that had been raised with everything he could ever want. While he was satisfied with the minimum amount of time his busy father spent with him during his childhood, those around him would praise him endlessly. Even if he caused a little trouble here and there, no one would scold him. But even for someone like Stuart, there were two turning points of his life. The first was when he was 11 and participated in the outdoor drill at the Royal Academy, during which the incident where Flora nearly fell off the cliff occurred. The blame had been falsely shifted to the orphan, Rio, but it was the first time Stuart had provoked the fierce rage of Duke Huguenot since he was born. However, contrary to the intense emotions of rage, Duke Huguenot was exceedingly cold. Instead of verbally abusing his son for the failure, he listened to Stuart directly explain the events that happened. There will be no next time. He'd concluded with those menacing words, his cold gaze mixed with disappointment and contempt. Why yes, sir. It was the first time Stuart felt fear toward his father. At the same time, he realized that he would never be a subject of his father's familial love. Because Duke Huguenot had not felt anger towards his son, but anger at prioritizing himself over his family. When he had said there will be no next time, the Duke was declaring that the next time Stuart made a fatal mistake, he would be mercilessly discarded as nothing more than a defective item. To Duke Huguenot, he was no more than a political tool. Stuart finally realized that harsh truth. Perhaps it was from then onwards that Stuart became more aware of his status in society. While his outward attitude did not change, he was constantly aware of whether he was dealing with people higher or lower than him, constantly checking and clarifying his own status. As a result, Stuart discriminated more against those he believed were below him, while interacting carefully with those he was unsure of or above him. The second turning point of Stuart's life was when his father, Duke Huguenot, lost his position. He learned that even his terrifying father could fall. Perhaps he had misjudged their status, or maybe there were other complicated factors that had contributed. Still, when he considered that, Stuart suddenly felt fed up with the life of a noble. There was no way he could change his lifestyle at the age of 15, and he had already been raised as a noble accustomed to a certain standard of living. However, Stuart had no confidence in his ability to behave as Duke Huguenot's successor well in the future. If there was a successor, it would be his little brother. Some people even believed Duke Huguenot had raised his brother as the main succession candidate. What a pain in the ass. When Stuart firmly started to believe that, he appealed to Duke Huguenot to become a knight instead. As a result, his request was accepted readily and he was placed in the elite guard tasked with protecting Flora. It was awkward being with Flora due to their history at the Royal Academy's outdoor drill, but he wasn't about to object to any orders from his father. Thus began Stuart's life as a knight, but there were rarely any dangerous missions to go around when following royalty like Flora. At most, he would go and exterminate monsters in the name of practical training, and complete escort mission trainings. However, even then, Stuart's life was fulfilling. He didn't need to think about anything when he was swinging his sword at monsters, and it was a good form of stress relief. On top of that, he had a partner in crime in the form of his upperclassman from their academy days, his now colleague Alphonse Rodin. Alphonse was the second son of Marquis Rodin, and another stereotypical example of a prodigal son. He was similar to Stuart in the way that he liked to use his status to the maximum degree, doing as he liked. Ever since being appointed into the same elite guard for Flora, Stuart and Alphonse hung out more than ever before. They would eliminate monsters together, eat meals from the same pot, and drink together while grumbling. Recently, they even started polishing their skills in womanizing together, as noble prodigal sons would. As time progressed, Sokota Hirooki had become their charge after he'd been summoned, but that had made no significant impacts on Stuart's life. If he had to pick a bone with something, then it was probably the fact he secretly considered Hirooki to be intolerable and detested him, thanks to Hirooki's clearly condescending attitude. Today's events changed nothing. The boy named Haruto had suddenly appeared at the scene, slaughtering the powerful minotaurs in front of Lizelot's attendants, who lavished him with attention, which was understandable. While they weren't happy having the best part taken away from them, most of the knights present, including Stuart, had shuddered in awe at the sight of how he'd fought. It was the reason why Stuart and Alphonse decided to use that as a topic to approach the beautiful ladies that served Lizelot. And so, after arriving at Amand, the two knights started chatting up the attendant girls in the garden of Lizelot's estate good-naturedly. Hirooki must have been listening, as he suddenly interrupted. Well, intruding on another party's battle and stealing all the limelight isn't really something to praise. Right beside him were Flora and Roanna. The friendly air that Stuart and Alphonse had built up dispersed in an instant. Forgive me for asking, great hero, but what do you mean by that? Despite his irritation, Stuart questioned Hirooki courteously. We were finally fighting with coordination. If a third party slips into the fight without permission, what do you think would happen? Of course the fight wouldn't go as planned, ruining everything. Well, the one stealing the kills probably thought he was being helpful. If you ask me, it's bad manners. Hirooki sighed in exasperation. Stuart let out a dumbfounded reply. The first half of that speech aside, he had completely lost track of what Hirooki was saying partway. There were no manners in a life-or-death battle with monsters. Well, I can understand his feelings of irritation, watching the small fry desperately struggle to fight. Guys who steal kills like that tend to crave attention like, oh my god, look at me, I'm strong, right? I'll lend you a hand. It's an act that steals the opportunity for those already fighting to learn and develop. It spoils the mood, since lots of people hate having their prey snatched from under their nose. It was a statement that completely insulted the knights that had been on the battlefield. However, Hirooki didn't seem to realize that, as he continued to blabber away without pause. In the end, Roanna had to prompt Hirooki to move on before he wandered away, ruining the mood for any further discussion as the attendant girls soon took their leave to return to work. Stuart, in the meantime, headed to the guest facilities allocated to them for the day in displeasure. It was a splendid building directly beside Lizelot's estate. However, even though there was good food and drink, there were no women. Lizelot's servants were present, but they weren't about to make the servants pour their drinks for them. And so, on this visit to Amand too, Stuart headed out to the city with Alphonse to clear their gloomy moods. While part of the reason was due to his irritation at Hirooki's earlier ignorant remark, he had also just gone through a battle of life and death with more monsters than he had ever faced before, leaving his mind and body helplessly worked up. They headed to a bar targeted towards the wealthy and had a drink and snacks before happily moving on to another bar that specialized in entertainment from women. Having previously visited this store and paid good money, they were remembered as important customers and welcomed warmly, and chose two of the prettier girls among the staff to serve them. Well, he's all talk and attitude. There's nothing much else to him, really. They spoke their complaints about someone in particular whilst drinking heartily. Eventually, the name of a famous restaurant in Amand was brought up. Yeah, we've been to that store before. I can take you there now, if you'd like, Stuart said, showing off. The girls were completely on board with it, so Stuart and Alphonse left the bar with the girls in high spirits. However, the situation took a turn once they arrived at the aforementioned restaurant. They'd decided on using the best private room for the occasion, but when he requested the room, our deepest apologies. That room is already in use by another customer. I can prepare another private room for you right away. The room Stuart was after was already in use. It was like someone had dumped cold water on him after he'd finally recovered his mood. Well, why don't you show us the other options first? Alphonse said high-handedly. With that, the male employee leads Stuart's party inside the shop. I think I want the room I requested after all. Can't you prepare that instead? Alphonse insisted unreasonably. I'm sorry, that private room is already in use by another customer. Just get them to change rooms. I'll pay you 3 times as much. I'm sorry, I cannot do that. Alphonse picked a fight, but the employee shook his head quietly. Is the room really in use? Alphonse said, doubting the employee's words. Of course it is, the man replied, nodding his head curtly. It was at this point that the girls accompanying them started looking concerned. They could tell that the scene was gradually worsening. Then I want to see with my own eyes whether it's actually in use or not. Perhaps the alcohol in Alphonse's system gave him a confidence boost, or perhaps he was starting to get irritated at the employee's resolute attitude, as he started walking with a sullen look. Hold on a minute, sir. Naturally, the employee tried to stop him, but Alphonse didn't waver. He continued his brisk walk forwards to the private room they had used before. Alphonse's bad habit is showing again, Stuart thought calmly when Alphonse started bickering with the employee, sobering up a little. It would be humiliating to back down in front of the girls they wanted to impress, so he decided that if worse came to worst, he could just let money handle the situation. Thus, they arrived before their target room, but the girls appeared to be frightened, which wasn't ideal, obviously. We're visiting as very important guests. The upper class of this city will hear of this, Stuart said to reassure the girls. If you're referring to Lady Liselot, then please, feel free to appeal to her directly. We are simply following our instructions. The employee's attitude became even more resolute in response to Stuart's words. What? I even prepared a point of compromise for him to accept. Stuart sulked for a moment. What a stubborn fool. Enough, it's no use speaking with you. You'd better watch your back later, he found himself saying before he knew it. As you wish, the inn's employee replied bluntly. Alphonse must have run out of patience, as he spoke up in irritation. That's enough, Stuart. We'll settle this with the other customers ourselves. You may not, the employee protested. Move it. You're in the way, Alphonse declared loudly, forcibly pushing the employee out of the way. Sir. You cannot do this, the employee yelled, but Alphonse was already standing before the door to the room, and opened it without knocking. What a commotion. Rio glanced at the intruders and stood up with a sigh. For a brief moment, Celia took one look at Stuart and Alphonse's faces and startled, but he didn't notice. These two. Rio thought oddly. Like with Flora and Roanna, they seemed familiar. For now, he decided to treat them as though they were meeting for the first time. Stuart and Alphonse were wearing their own clothing instead of their night uniforms, but it was easy to tell at a glance that their clothes were of nobility. Behind them stood 2 girls looking idle, both wearing clothes that were stylish but slightly flashy. The employee that had been shoved aside by Alphonse belatedly rushed into the room. At the same time, he turned to Rio's party and bowed his head in a panic. My deepest apologies, sir. Could you explain what's going on here? Rio responded in a flat tone. Stuart seemed to realize something, narrowing his eyes suspiciously. Celia flinched with her whole body, immediately ducking her head down. Stuart and Alphonse were 2 of her former students. She was worried that they might have recognized her true identity. Aren't you that Haruto guy? Stuart stared at Rio and asked. I'm sorry, and who might you be? Rio returned curiously. Forgive me. My knowledge of you was one-sided. I am Stuart Huguenot, and this is Alphonse Rodin. If I told you that we are knights from the group you saved today, would that ring a bell? Stuart introduced himself smoothly as he studied Rio's face. Is that so? My apologies for the rudeness. Rio tipped his head lightly in a show of politeness. Hearing their names had completely triggered his memories of the 2. There was no way he could have forgotten, since this man was the root of all evil behind the false accusation placed on his head. Alphonse was his former classmate, too. No, that's fine, Stuart gloated with a smug huff. While things had taken a slightly troublesome turn, if the boy wasn't a stranger to his family background, then everything would work out, Stuart thought confidently. In reality, the attendant seemed to be at a loss for what to do, seeing Rio and Stuart being acquainted already. The girls who had come along with them were also looking at Stuart in awe. This is rather strange, Rio thought. So, what brings you to this room? He asked, just in case. We wanted to use this room. Alphonse cut to the chase. This exact room? Alphonse's declaration was so bold, Rio couldn't help but react in shock. Upon closer inspection, Alphonse's face was red. It was clear he was drunk. This is why drunks are such a pain. No, not drunks. High and mighty nobles. Rio held back the urge to sigh and chose to leave quietly instead. It would be too much of a bother to deal with these two any longer. We had just finished eating ourselves. Please, feel free to come in, Rio said, sending a message to Celia and Asia seated at the table behind him with a casual look. Asia and Celia nodded silently and stood up. It was at this point that Stuart and the others finally noticed Celia and Asia. When they spotted the beauty of the girls, they couldn't help but gulp. Come here, you two. Rio guided Celia over, then stood as a wall between them and Stuart's group. They briskly tried to make their way out of the room. Hey, hold on a minute, Alphonse called out. Yes. Rio replied, directly in the firing line. Let's compromise. Why don't you join us for a meal and drinks? Alphonse extended a hand in invitation while looking at Asia and Celia. While we are very grateful for the offer, we have unfortunately already finished eating and drinking, Rio said, shaking his head bluntly. Oh, you're rejecting our invitation? Alphonse asked in a bold tone. I apologize. It has been a long journey here. Rio's answer did not change. While his words were courteous, his approach to rejection was firm. I see. I can't say I'm impressed at how you're rejecting a noble's invitation. You may be skilled at the sword, but you're still a commoner, no? Isn't that right, Stuart? Alphonse said with condemnation, turning to Stuart for backup. After a short pause, Stuart nodded and looked towards Asia and Celia. Yes, I suppose I do agree. He figured Rio was staying at this inn as Liselot's savior and guest, so he didn't think it would be smart to act too strongly before him. However, he also thought it'd be a shame if Asia and Celia were to depart like this. I ask for your leniency. Rio showed no sign of faltering at their roundabout threats and shook his head respectfully, moving to take his leave. Hey, hold on. You can't gain social position through your sword hand alone. It'd be a shame, what with skills as wonderful as yours. Don't you have some interest in climbing up in the world? Depending on your attitude, we could put in a good word for you to become a knight. Alphonse was also a stubborn man, and flaunted gains to attempt at some level of negotiation. I'm fine as is. And I am tired, so if you'd excuse me. Rio continued to shake his head bluntly. Sensing that the atmosphere had turned sour once again, the two girls that had accompanied Stuart and Alphonse shrunk back into the corner. Sir, if you bother our other customers any more than this, I'm afraid we will have to respond appropriately on our part too. The male employee's face had also grown pale, but even he felt the need to intervene here and gave a warning to keep them in check. Alphonse, I think this is Eno, Stuart tried to warn. While it would result in utterly destroying their reputation, he turned to self-preservation as things started to get out of hand. No, hold on. I'll try one last time. At the very least, how about those two stay with us instead? How about it, girls? Alphonse seemed to be past the point of no return, desperately holding back his irritation as he addressed Asia and Celia in a gentlemanlike manner. However, both Asia and Celia held their silence and ignored him like Rio had told them to. Alphonse must have considered this a great humiliation, as his face twisted greatly. Now, if that was all you needed. We shall take our leave, Rio sighed flatly, giving Celia and Asia a gentle nudge in the back to move them out of the room. On their way past the male employee, he leaned in to whisper, I'm sorry for the commotion. Oh, and there is no need to report this to Lady Liselot either, if you so wish. It was the least he could offer in gratitude for the employee's attempts at protecting them. He didn't want him to feel responsible over such a ridiculous matter. My deepest apologies. The employee bowed his head in a fluster. He had been given strict orders from Arya to treat Liselot's savior with the utmost hospitality, yet this had happened. Meanwhile, Stuart's face darkened uncomfortably as he realized their mistake, while in contrast, Alphonse allowed his rage to completely consume him. Hey, wait, he muttered furiously, But Rio did not stop walking. "I told you to wait," Alphonse finally yelled. He stood before the door, blocking their path. "Yes." At Rio's nonplussed question, Alphonse glared at him with hostility. "You dare insult me, eh, Alphonse?" Stuart hurriedly tried to stop Alphonse, but he ignored Stuart's attempt at restraint and flared up at Rio. "It seems you don't know how to behave before a noble." Instead of considering his options logically, his humiliated emotions were completely leading the way. Being born and raised as the son of a high-ranked noble meant he had never needed to learn how to control his temper as a child, making him easier to anger. "Unfortunately, I was born as a commoner, so I do not. Have I unknowingly done something to offend you?" Rio cocked his head curiously. While his choice of words were polite, his phrasing was provocative. It was the ultimate move of superficial manners. Celia saw through that side of Rio and made a worried face out of nervousness. Aisha grabbed her hand and squeezed it. "Ha! Ha ha ha! I never expected a mere commoner to make this much of a fool out of me. I see you think so highly of yourself, with your common sword and common women. But I can use my right to strike at any moment, you do realize?" Alphonse said with a twitching smile. The right to strike was a special privilege for nobility that allowed them to kill when their honor was compromised. "Oh my! I've heard that the requisites for the right to strike can be extremely severe depending on national or territorial laws. Which requisite have I fulfilled in dictionarying you? I'd like to see you try," was what Rio was strongly implying. The requisites for right to strike were to be investigated after the action was performed, but if Alphonse tried to declare he was dishonored by being ignored when flirting with girls while drunk, he'd be completely ridiculed. Not to mention the fact Amand was under Liselot's governing. It would be one thing if they were within the kingdom of Beltrum where Alphonse had influence, but there was no way that nonsense would be accepted in another country. That being said, a commoner with no knowledge of how the right to strike worked would have cowered in fear by now, yet Rio did not falter an inch. Goo, having the faults in his request so easily raised had Alphonse glaring at Rio hatefully. Even he knew he was at a logical disadvantage. However, his haughty pride wouldn't allow him to back down to a mere commoner after being humiliated so much already. "Have you had enough yet?" Rio could no longer hide his exasperation in his question to Alphonse. Alphonse stared at Rio sharply. Out of the blue, he lunged forward at Rio with his fist held high. "Shut the hell up, you lowly commoner." "Kia!" Celia screamed from behind Rio. He couldn't avoid him by stepping to the side, nor could he step backwards, either. Thus, Rio engaged with Alphonse from head-on. After grasping the arm that had been raised in a punch, he gracefully pinned Alphonse down to the ground. "Oh!" Alphonse cried out, the pain unbearable. "What?" Stuart's gaze was stolen by how skillful Rio's restraint techniques were. He had no idea what movement was taken just now to restrain Alphonse so well. "Hey Alphonse! Hey, you! Release him!" Stuart objected, having returned to his senses after a moment. In that time, Aisha took the chance to pull Celia's hand and place distance between themselves and Rio. "I'm afraid I must object to that. If I release him, he'll attack me right away." "It's legitimate self-defense," Rio thought flatly. Shut up." Rio's response seemed to have touched a nerve, as Stuart tried to grab at him. At that, Rio swiftly stood up and evaded Stuart's hand, and as a result, Stuart's momentum caused him to stumble over his feet. "Grr!" He corrected his balance immediately, now glaring at Rio angrily. The now released Alphonse also struggled to his feet. "You've done it now, you bastard!" Alphonse yelled, lunging again to punch him. However, Rio evaded his fist lightly, all while barely moving from his spot. "Coup!" Alphonse completely snapped, continuing to swing his fist. Rio finally had enough and sighed in exasperation, slapping away Alphonse's fist. Then, he grabbed Alphonse's arm and twisted it while standing up. "Gua!" Alphonse's face twisted. "Alphonse! What?" Stuart tried to jump to his rescue, hurriedly grabbing Rio. However, Rio shoved Alphonse's body away, sending the two of them falling over each other dramatically. Goo! Everyone other than Aisha averted their eyes at the pitiful scene. As a result, silence fell over the room. During that time, Rio silently moved his body, approaching where Stuart and Alphonse had fallen over each other. He pushed them both down from above, easily restraining them. Goo, hey, what do you think you're doing? Let go, damn it. Stuart and Alphonse complained in an unsightly way, but Rio paid them no heed. He continued to restrain them without letting his guard down. However, he couldn't remain in this position forever. Rio sighed in annoyance before addressing the employee, who was standing still in a daze. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like this can be settled peacefully after all. Could you please call someone here who can deal with these two appropriately?